Hi, we're with Dr. Amanda Stanek with a PhD in expertise in physical education, sports wellness consulting, and somebody who's obviously through those experiences in professional areas that you work in, you've followed the Olympic movement, in particular the IOC's bid to consider another sport, and it's down to wrestling, baseball, softball, and squash. So we asked you to come in today and talk a little bit to us about how women's issues are really affecting this process and how critical they are to making that decision. So thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me. It's great. It's great to be here.
Okay. Well, one of the things, in our project on DesMoinesRegister.com, Wrestling's Olympic Fight, we've looked at so many angles related to how this bid process will finalize itself in September in Argentina. And a logical next step, I think, is to talk about how women's issues in sports are not just a fringe factor. They're a critical factor to how that decision is going to be made. Wrestling has added in the last 3 months women in more leadership positions. They're adding more participation opportunities in weight classes, and baseball has added softball to kind of bring in that gender equity balance to try to improve their bid chances. Could you compare both those efforts and what they mean and what they signal, and who's in better position if you had to handicap this?
I think that, first of all, I would like to think that girls and women in sport are influencing this decision as the IOC moves forward in September. When you look at their website and you see the number of active members on the IOC committee, there is a 18 to 92 female-male ratio, and of honorary members, it's a 3 to 32 ratio of female to male. And I understand it's life appointment for the active members, but so, we think and we hope that women are influencing this decision forward, and that we've seen baseball have a partnership with softball, and we have seen some changes from the Wrestling Federation considering and hoping that this is the case. I think that adding women in leadership roles with wrestling is a very positive move. I feel like wrestling in the media has far too often in the U.S., North America, if you will, ignored females' participation in the sport when it has such an amazing influence on a global scale related to social mobility and some of these things, how it is so important in so many developing countries, how women who wrestle can boost social status of a family and change their social mobility within their communities. So I feel like having women in leaders in this sport is huge, a very positive move for its bid. If I was making the decision, I think that increasing weight classes is also a very positive move. Having four compared to how many there were in men doesn't do a whole lot to grow the sport globally or here at home. I think that softball merging with baseball for their bid is I can see why they did it. That's a lot of money right there. And then you can play the female angle on that, if you will. However, when you look at baseball's unwillingness to stop their professional season to participate in the Olympics, you have to wonder, here at home, they're putting effort into it, but they're not willing, for my humble opinion, to go the whole way. So I don't know if it will really aid softball for this partnership, where they already have such support from women's sports foundations through the history of the sport here at home.
And that's a good point. We've talked about in some of the things we've written that baseball might benefit from that partnership, but maybe softball potentially doesn't. If baseball brings something to the table, the IOC might consider more of a hindrance than a benefit. But as you look at how wrestling's approached embracing women's roles in the recent months related to their bid, and baseball adding softball, are either of them ahead of the other in terms of what they're doing? I guess one of the major differences between those, softball's just bringing in the participation piece, wrestling's bringing in leadership and participation. Are either of them, if you had to handicap it, are ahead of the game in terms of competing against each other for a bid?
I think this has to be looked at. I think it's almost two separate conversations. I feel like there is a North American or an American conversation, and then there's the sport from a global scale, which of course is what the Olympics are all about. And so I look at here at home, I think that there is not a lot of wonderful blood between the sport of wrestling and women's sports foundations due to lawsuits regarding Title IX and so forth. However, the relationship
True.
with these foundations and softball is wonderful, and the participation rates of young females who participate in softball in this country is astronomical. However, when you look at it from a global scale and how many sports participate in the sport of wrestling, females at the Olympic level, as opposed to the dominance of only several countries in softball when they were in the Olympics, I feel like wrestling has should have a huge advantage from a global perspective.
In terms of the reach, there are fewer softball federations and fewer that contend for medals than in Olympic women's wrestling could probably hit more countries in that reach category.
Yes, I think the data will show us that more females from more countries win medals in women's wrestling than that was the case with softball. And I also, the human stories that are coming out of some of the, like the nonprofit wrestling roots, for example, on social mobility with women in the global scale. I mean, I don't know another sport that's happening. And from a inclusion perspective, I care deeply about providing opportunity for people with disabilities to participate in sport. Female wrestlers are able to participate at the Olympic level, with one leg against people who may have two. And so I think that from a global and inclusion lens, I feel like when this decision is made, those are all topics that should come into the conversation, and not just how many participants in the U.S. are participating in softball.
If you look at this from the perspective of the kind of timeline of women's sports in the Olympics, and we keep it kind of focused on this wrestling softball piece, and we'll talk a little bit about squash too, but I don't know that the issue of developing itself for women's involvement is as distinct there as it is in these two bids. But as you look at it, the timeline, softball went through a period of kind of getting its legs under it, having an Olympic history, being known. Women's hockey and the Winter Olympics went through that piece. It had always been considered a men's sport on an Olympic level for so long, and then women's hockey kind of dug in and got its momentum. Wrestling is probably a little bit behind in terms of that momentum with women's involvement in that sport than softball. Does softball have an edge there because of its Olympic history? Is wrestling playing catch up in that, I guess, in that area?
I think here in the U.S. it absolutely is. I feel like the softball's had a lot of really amazing media. There's been movies out. There's been people who have made livings on endorsements who participated for the U.S. in softball. I feel like the U.S. Wrestling community has almost, in some ways, a storied history with women, with how Title IX has been, how it's been. How schools have made decisions to meet mandates of the law. It's often been at a disadvantage for male wrestlers. And I am an advocate for all sport and all participating in sport. I'm not an advocate of cutting sport for men so more women can have opportunity. I am an advocate for increasing opportunity for all. And I feel like softball definitely has an advantage in the U.S. for that. I feel like wrestling, when you go on some of their Twitter sites now, they are showing Clarissa Chun, like some of
Right.
these amazing athletes. They need to become household names, just like Jake Herbert, just like Jordan Burroughs, just like Cale Sanderson. These names that are coming at you, Dan Gable, many years after retirement. We need to hear stories about these females who are participating in wrestling. If wrestlers truly care about their sport, they will embrace women's participation, and they will work tirelessly to provide women opportunities to participate at the high school and collegiate level here in the U.S. And softball has been, since League of Their Own, it's been a cool thing for females to do, and so it doesn't have that barrier here in the U.S.
Are there any levels of women's involvement in the Olympics that you still feel like potentially face that kind of tired stereotype and of, oh, that's not feminine, that's not. Does anybody
Absolutely.
face that? And if so, what do you think about that?
I think it's really unfortunate. I think it's wrong. I think it's the 21st century, and how many things do women need to overcome in order to, realize that we are not deterring anybody from anything, and we're we're helpful, positive members of everything that we are involved in. And so when female athletes are discussed in articles about their ponytails or the color hair
Right.
or their smile, you must question, how far we must yet travel. And I feel like it doesn't really matter what a male wrestler looks like. If he's a successful wrestler, he's going to be highlighted, whereas a female may need to look into what society determines to be an attractive manner for that to be highlighted. So I think that there's a lot of work to be done in accurately portraying female athletes for their athletic accomplishments and talents and gifts.
Did it? I'm just thinking of this off the top of my head as you bounce this. Did when the women's kind of soccer American Dream team was in the Olympics? Did that change? Did that move the bar at all in terms of the? It seemed like there was a lot of discussion of their ability, their performance. It was, Mia Hamm became a face out of that, and many of her teammates did. But was that a bit of a turning point where there was a lot more focus, it seemed to me, on the performance and the result there?
I think there was, but I think that they also many members of that team looked like what society deems to be attractive, and I think that's what America really really loved about them is they were excellent athletes. They won, and they looked a certain way. I feel like, and that's oftentimes when you have two players of equal status, the one who's getting the Nike contracts happens to fit that mold, whereas the one who may not dress or appear as feminine will miss out on a lot of those endorsements. And it's slowly sometimes changing, but often not.
How do you feel that team, if its stars look differently, how do you think they would have been perceived or received or written about or talked about on television differently?
That'd be less about their beauty and their their physical appearance and more about their ability to get the job done and their tactical savviness and their skills and their speed and their strength and their somebody, when you remember at the time, Brandi Chastain, she was just totally elated and ripped off her jersey. Right. And it was that's what was talked about for weeks later. It's a tradition in soccer to celebrate such a goal. And so that's, I think if she didn't look a certain way when she ripped that off, the discussion would have even taken a different turn.
And what you hinted at this a little bit ago, but softball with stars, and Jennie Finch is one of those names that really got marketed and became the face of softball at the Olympic level and international level. Other sports, Danica Patrick in auto racing, Anna Kournikova in tennis. Are those sports, and Jennie Finch in softball in particular, are they savvy to kind of market someone like that to bring attention no matter how they bring attention to the sport? Or is that disappointing to many because it puts the emphasis in one area as opposed to maybe results and performance and ability? And just to follow up on that, does wrestling need to market more of its athletes in a certain way?
I think that some of the names you mentioned, it becomes a bit of a different story. Of those names, I think that Anna Kournikova is probably the most known. Although of those names you mentioned, she's probably the least "quote unquote" successful in terms of wins. I mean, Jennie Finch was, I believe it was a 2 or 3 or 4 time All-American. She was
right.
MVP in college, like 2 years. So yes, she looked a certain way, but she also was a really amazing softball player. She's retired. I think it was 2010, and her name is still known. I mean, that's amazing. And if that's, I feel like we market our male athletes. I feel like we do need to market more. I think that wrestling should definitely be promoting their female participants, and I feel like wrestlers have such pride in their sport that they're going to respect anyone who wrestles if that person is a good wrestler. And I feel like that's what needs to be marketed is the talent. And if that doesn't happen, then how are kids going to grow up and see themselves in those athletes?
So to your point, if wrestling markets the talent of its female participants, and rightly or wrongly, that doesn't always draw the kind of national or international attention and focus that some of the other storylines do, even if they're predictable, even if people have concerns about those storylines. So where's that balance of doing what you need to do to grow the sport with outside attention without cheapening the efforts of talented female wrestlers?
I think the balance remains making sure people are aware that this is such a popular sport in the world. I mean, what wrestling is doing for women in some countries is unlike most stories I've heard in sport. It's hard to believe it's 2013 and these stories are emerging from sport. In developing countries, I mean, where women are in daily fear of rape, where it's acceptable in a community, if they are winning wrestling matches, they are safe. They are respected by men who otherwise don't respect women in their countries. To have it eliminated from the Olympics, to me, would be a true shame and a real negligence on the part of the IOC, because this is, to me, the spirit and the purpose of sport. This is what makes sport great.
Is that example that you give about women's wrestlers in developing countries? How is that different than developing countries with softball or developing countries with squash? Is the wrestling women's experience different?
I believe so, because to wrestle you need one person. You don't need anything. You just need one person. And I feel like following, I like to follow, well, it's part of my job to be abreast of sports and sport media, and following certain groups on Twitter who have helped shed light on this. It hasn't been a federation per se, but people who have a passion for it have, I just I haven't seen the images of females in softball in some of these countries, developing countries, like I've seen what it's done for the sport of wrestling. And then it comes also back to the inclusion piece that I don't feel we can have this conversation without is, you can be born without a leg and you can participate in this sport at the Olympic level. And I think that that is also the spirit of sport, and that is what we want kids at home in all of these countries to turn on during the Olympics and see and to believe and to understand. Here is a place for me. I can participate in this, and that's why I feel like with more educating men and women on the importance of how wrestling can help women and women with physical disabilities, it will really give wrestling an advantage. But I think the attitude here at home and this very masculine, women need to look a certain way, and yes, they can play softball if they have sparkly ribbons and lipstick on, but wrestling, I'm not so sure. I think that is really hurting wrestling because the U.S. has a loud voice in wrestling.
As we look at this bid process, two of the three, there were 8 sports groups that got narrowed down in an International Olympic Committee vote in Russia to 3, and we've talked primarily about 2, but squash is the third. Is this any kind of a benchmark in global sports for women? And here's how I mean that. 2 of the 3 bids that involve multi-million-dollar decisions, hundreds of nations, that either wrestling's in or it's out, either baseball, softball's in or it's out. 2/3 of these bids are building their cases. One of the fundamental bedrock case-building arguments they're making is we care about women's involvement, we're increasing opportunities, they're embracing that piece of the puzzle in terms of trying to appeal to the IOC. 2/3 of these bids are really placing high emphasis on women's involvement. Does that signal any kind of a benchmark? Is this a moment of any kind, if that makes sense?
It makes sense. I would really like to hope that this is an important piece to the decision making. I alluded to this earlier. I'm not so sure when you have approximately 18 women to 92 men on the committee in its lifetime appointment, and a lot of these men may or may not have very traditional, strong views on this. So I think that's really hard to predict on the people who are voting where they come from. I think that the perception, it is unique in that even the perception matters now. There were more females who participated in London than males. So I think that is something that needs to be, or at least on the U.S. team, and I think that is something that needs to be a part of the conversation always. I don't know if it weighs that much heavier. I think that it's a really interesting conversation. It's bringing attention to female participation in sport, which is always a positive for girls and women in sport. But again, I would hate for it to become a conversation. It's we versus them as a sport advocate for all. I hate when it's used to cut back on male participation, because the IOC doesn't have to cut back male weight classes in wrestling to increase women's. It could cut out a couple swimming events. Like, there are so many things that we're pitting, male versus women, instead of let's
Maybe,
collaborate here, and let's remember the true meaning of sport
and maybe
and the
the argument's
Olympics.
event versus event as opposed to men versus women, or so
Absolutely.
you mentioned
Yeah.
this too. I mean, that used to be a real debated, discussed, emotional point when Title IX legislation happened. I know the wrestling community in general thought for a long time that Title IX in particular led to the removal of lots of college wrestling programs. But then so many things have happened, and here we are having this discussion on Skype about two-thirds of the bids for the next available Olympics in 2020, how ensuring women's roles in it is a huge part of potentially being successful. So in that way, it's a really positive. It took years and years and years leap, but at the same time, in Iowa just a few years ago, in high school wrestling, a boy refused to wrestle a girl who had qualified for this tournament. Became a national story for a few weeks there. He cited religious reasons, but those are kind of two polar examples if you're looking at where are we now. So where are we now? That's a broad question,
Yeah.
but where are we?
Yeah, I think that, having it separate can be okay. Equitable is not equal. And I feel like wrestling, in the recent years since Title IX, the way Title IX has been administrated has definitely negatively impacted the sport of and male participation in wrestling at the collegiate level. And I think that is, as a huge advocate for girls and women in sport, I think that is just so wrong on so many levels. And I think that you can't have that discussion without further looking at the sport of football and some of these things, because what happens is wrestling got in the women's sport arena, it gets a lot of bad press because of this blaming women, when you got to wonder, is it women in society, or is it just big sport business and business in collegiate sport, and should it be there? I mean, I feel like wrestling is, it should not be cut. It should not have been on the chopping block. I'm glad to see it reemerging in many cases. In Iowa, where there's the separate, girls high school sport division and males, I feel like if you have a female leader who is a equal pay, equal job responsibility as the male leader of the boys, I think that can be an extremely positive. You look at Title IX, and yes, there are a lot more women participating in sport, but when Title IX was implemented, 90-some% of the female coaches at the collegiate level were females, and now only 40-some% of collegiate coaches of female sports are females. So there's men making a lot of livings and men off of Title IX from a coaching perspective with that. So I feel like sometimes different is better, because it can be more equitable. So times of things can be changed to attract more female coaches who still have want to be home and this can be interpreted any way you want, but can want to be home, to be with families, to have dinner with their children. With a lot of collegiate coaching, it doesn't warrant that, and it causes for women to feel like they're having to choose. And so like early morning practices or things like this, and re-looking at how we have things different and maybe separate, but yet equitable, rather than always trying to have women fit in with the male model. And if they don't fit in, then okay, well, let's kick them out. So I think that it could be a really unique time. And I feel like there's a lot at stake. But I would like to see everybody come together and work together for the promotion of sport and participation and in the spirit of the Olympic movement, and not a we versus them in a gender, but how can we get everyone moving? Everyone moving. There's human interest for all genders and all ages, and what causes the most movement in the most countries and can help elevate status and include kids with disabilities. And to me, then, it's a bias, but I mean, I love all sports, but I feel like wrestling in the Olympic movement, that's why it belongs, not because it's the oldest sport, and not because so-and-so says that you can't, once you've done wrestling, everything else is hard or easy, but because of what it can do for girls and women and people with disabilities at a global scale. It's a very important sport in society.
Iowa, the Des Moines Register, we're in Iowa, so that's our backyard in terms of talking about some of these things. Iowa was kind of a trailblazer going back to, well before Title IX legislation. They had two separate high school athletic administrators and governing bodies for girls and boys. It was the only one in the country, and it still exists, and it may be the only one in the country now. But that was a signal of the importance and the balance and the equity. And then they began to have state high school tournaments they showed on television for like girls basketball. They sold out Saturday Night Championship. They marketed in a way where it was just as valuable a product that drew fans as boys tournaments. In fact, in a lot of years, they outdrew a lot of the boys tournaments in this state. I think the mentality that made that exist in Iowa, and the question I'd have for you related to this, is essentially the right person in the right group in a moment said, this is important, we're going to do it, and we'll just wait for you to catch up with our thinking. We're not going to wait for this to go through committees. We're going to do it. We know it's important now. You'll figure it out later. Has wrestling had or the Olympics, has the Olympics had that moment with women's sports, or does it need another moment like that? And if so, what is it where they just go out on a limb and say, we're going to shake the model up, and here's how we're going to value women's participation?
Yeah, I think by making sure, one of the things when you look at softball, baseball, I know that's the real topic of the conversation, kind of versus wrestling. You look at, okay, so there is female participation in one bid, and now there's increased weight classes and increased female leadership roles in the sport of wrestling. So you've got women, in that bid, and I think that is a very key component going forward. I think that there are a lot of female Olympians go on to make great livings from the U.S. after the Olympics, and so I feel like whether they're swimmers or gymnasts, or there's a lot of there is a lot of talk and a lot of hype, and a lot of women athletes are big draws. And so I think that is a positive, and I think it will continue to be that way, as it should. I mean, good sport is good sport.
And if you were, we'll put you in your own leadership role here. You just got elected to make decisions for the International Olympic Committee. What would you want out of, in terms of the discussion about women's involvement, what would you want wrestling to do? What would you want baseball, softball to do? What would you want squash to do? What would you're Jock Rogue for a couple of minutes here. What do you ask of those sports?
I think what I would ask of those sports is to really make sure that people become aware of the importance of those sports throughout society. I think that we're also at a time where people can kind of throw their arms up and say, what's the purpose of this? This is a lot of money that we're pouring into the Olympics, and if you're hosting a lot of taxpayers' dollars and so forth. And I feel like bringing these stories to light of how, and why they're so important for society, much more so than professional sport, and why is it important in these developing countries. And look at we can get these three, Russia, Iran, and the U.S. at a table, right, when people who are getting paid a lot more money to do so can't. And so these, I think, as if I was the leader, I would make sure that there was an accurate representation, and I would make sure to work tirelessly so that women and girls who participate in softball and in wrestling were portrayed for their athletic accomplishments. I would work tirelessly to, if I was in charge of their bid, to make sure that we knew the names of all four Americans at all four weight classes in London. I would make sure that we didn't just know Jennie Finch's name because she was, yes, she was amazing, but she also had a lot of teammates around her who were hitting the ball and scoring runs. So I think that would be my advice to the people of those federations, is to make sure that we are portraying women and girls in sport for their athletic talents, and to make sure that girls at home can turn on the TV and see themselves in these different athletes, so that they
there's no doubt that the three sports groups bidding for the 2020 and 24 Olympics, and that'll be decided during a vote in September, there's no doubt that the role of women in the potential success of those bids is enormous, particularly for wrestling and baseball and softball. Dr. Amanda Stanek, we really appreciate your time and your willingness to talk about it, and thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you so much. It's a lot of fun to talk about this stuff, so
thanks.
I appreciate the opportunity.